A good Erev Shabbos. To me, it's a pretty interesting bibliographical footnote to history, but then again, I like those kind of things. For those who are students of English history or Shakespeare, or who saw the Broadway musical Six recently, you know one thing for sure. Henry VIII, King Henry, lived long before the invention of couples therapy. Now, I'm not a king, and I'm no couples therapist, but somehow I imagine that things might have worked out a bit differently if Henry had been empowered to articulate his feelings, to work together with his wife, whoever that was at the moment, to create a safe, loving space for each other and all that. Well, it didn't happen that way, and Henry seems to have been given a strong set of drives. He wound up a serial husband, probably not too happy of a person, and also, by the way, inventing a whole new religion where you could get divorced whenever it suited you, especially if you were the king. Now, Henry was frustrated by the Catholic Church's unwillingness to grant divorces at will. That much seems clear. However, before inventing a new church out of whole cloth, he did his research, and he consulted the best sources that he had heard of on the topic, which was the Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud, Tractate Gittin, whose topic is the notion of divorce in halakha, in Jewish law. As it happened, the latest technology was printing in those days, so Henry ordered not only Tractate Gittin, but the entire Shas, the complete printed set of the Talmud, which had been issued for the first time ever in 1519 by a Catholic publisher in Venice named Daniel Bomberg. This was also before Amazon, so it probably took a while to get there, but this set of Talmud eventually arrived in England and was consulted by the king's scholars, who apparently were able to find sufficient reason to allow Henry, as the head of the new Church of England, to divorce and remarry whomever he wanted, which eventually saved a lot of money on executions. Now, the footnote. That copy of the Talmud sat gathering dust in the library of Westminster Abbey until 1980, when the most renowned Hebrew book collector of our era, Jack Lunzer, who was a British Jew whose father worked for De Beers, he also went into the diamond business and, as a side pursuit, amassed a staggering collection of early Hebrew books and manuscripts, even predating Gutenberg. So he dreamed for about 25 years of acquiring this Westminster Talmud, as it came to be called, and he eventually got a hold of it. He traded it for a 900-year-old copy of the charter, the very charter of Westminster Abbey. Lunzer passed away 6 years ago, and his collection was broken up and sold by Sotheby's. This set of Westminster Talmud fetched some, are you ready? $9 million. There's certainly more to the story and more to Henry's story, but to sum it up in the words of Melvin Kaminsky, whom you know better as Mel Brooks, it's good to be the king. Our Parsha this week of Shoftim takes up the topic of kingship with great interest. You recall the discussions about self-rule that have taken place over many parshas we've read since the beginning of the Torah, the giving of the Torah at Sinai, way back in Parshas Yisro in the wintertime. Yisro himself, Moshe's father-in-law, famously advises his son not to overburden himself with judiciary responsibilities, rather to appoint judges at courts at multiple levels who will hear cases of dispute among Jews and settle them according to halakha. Apparently then, as now, we have a reputation for being quite a contentious, not to mention litigious people. But it's certainly better than beating people up, I think you'll have to admit. There are also questions of leadership and succession. Moshe realizes he's not going to live forever. He's not even going to get to lead the Bnei Yisrael into Eretz Yisrael. So he has to appoint Joshua as his successor, as leader. So in this week's Parsha of Shoftim, which means judges, as in judges and bailiffs you should appoint, that's how the Parsha begins, this topic of leadership is again addressed. In our experience as slaves under Pharaoh, and our encounter with other nations and their sovereigns in the 40 years journey through the desert, we became pretty familiar with monarchical forms of government and their pitfalls. And at the same time, this kind of authority must have had some attraction, because Moshe tells the Jewish nation to appoint themselves a king once we enter into and settle the land of Israel. Interestingly enough, it seems based on what we've observed in other nations' leaders, for better or worse. So the Torah says when you come into the land that God is giving you and you settle it and you make it your inheritance, Says Moshe Rabbeinu to us, Va'amarta asim alai melech, and you say to yourself, we should really appoint a king over ourselves, kechol hagoyim asher sevivaisai, like all the nations around us. Fine, says Moshe. Soim tasim alecha melech, he says in our parsha, chapter 17, verse 15 of Deuteronomy, Chumash Devarim. Appoint a king over yourselves. Asher yivchar Hashem elekecha boy, who God will choose. Mikerev achecha tasim alecha melech. It should be from among your brethren. Don't choose someone who's a foreigner to rule over you. Okay, so the history of Jewish monarchy is a longer story than we have time for in one day. But suffice it to say, it's a checkered history. We have luminaries like David HaMelech, King David, and at the same time we have Achaz, Menashe, Rishayim, wicked kings whose reign saw the spread of reprehensible behavior on the part of the Jewish nation. It's clear that the king does set the tone for the nation. When the king has his sights set higher, it can inspire the nation to higher aspirations. And of course, when the king is of lowly character, that has a similar effect. There are safeguards in this week's parsha that are codified into law. The king cannot amass a personal fortune of wealth or even horses, because that kind of pursuit will ultimately lead to corruption. Not only that, but the king has a mitzvah specific to him, and this is one of the 613 mitzvahs. It only applies to the Jewish king, although the rest of us are affected by it. He must write for himself, or have written for him, a Sefer Torah, a second Sefer Torah, in addition to the one that every Jew should write and possess. The king has to keep this additional Sefer Torah with him and study it and learn from it all the time and observe the mitzvahs so that he does not become arrogant or haughty. Rashi says he has to keep the Sefer Torah with him all the time when he comes and goes, quoting a Gemara in Sanhedrin. The king is, of course, the leader of the people, and he should remember that he himself is a follower of God and Torah. He's not the supreme power. Rather, he has the responsibility to lead the people by example in the right path of Jewish belief and practice. Without being too judgmental, this gives us plenty of space to discuss the standards of leadership that we ask of our governments today, don't you think? Maimonides codifies the responsibilities and limitations of the Jewish king in the very last section of his Mishnah Torah. Rambam's undertaking is to codify the entirety of Jewish law, every detail of each of the 613 mitzvahs, even those which are not operable in 13th century Spain, where he's living, like the laws of the temple and the service in the temple and Jewish kings. So in Hilchos Malachim, the laws of kings, Rambam spells out the biblical and Talmudic parameters for the monarchy that last functioned about 1,500 years before him. If you're interested in the details, you can read there about the king's lineage and how the appointment takes place, how the anointment takes place, where the anointment takes place. The kings have to be anointed with oil, how, which I think happened when Queen Elizabeth was crowned also, I believe. How the people must respect and revere the king, what responsibilities the king's consort carries, how he's to groom and conduct himself, and that the king is forbidden to become intoxicated. You can read how rebellion is forbidden and the penalty for it, the king's power to execute, to tax, to call out the army for wars of defense. He can also call out the troops for a war of territorial expansion with the approval of the Sanhedrin, if he can get it. With all these powers vested in the sovereign, you can imagine the easy leap the 20th century rabbinic scholars made to argue that the government of Israel had the power, or at least many of the powers, some of the powers anyway, of a Jewish king. Now we have to distinguish in our minds between that and theocracy, which is not what these scholars would maintain. We're asking here whether the power to tax, the power to draft soldiers into the army, and so on, is there a parallel between what halacha allows or permits or commands a king and what the government of the state of Israel, is permitted? In the fullest sense, the question is a moot one, because all the halachas of kingship that we've discussed are predicated on the rest of halacha, the acceptance of God's ultimate sovereignty over all the nation and the world, including the king, who ultimately has to follow the Torah himself. Obviously, it's highly unlikely, to say the least, that any Israeli government would feel itself obligated in such a way. Nevertheless, the comparative study is interesting because the historical fact is that the Jewish people were out of political power for a good 2,000 years. But it's not as if we forgot that such a thing existed or might one day again be within our grasp. The Rambam, writing almost midpoint between the destruction of the Second Temple in the early years of the Common Era and the birth of the state in 1948, is good evidence that these concepts were at least on people's minds throughout the long exile. Rambam writes that the king is like the heart of the people. It's an instructive metaphor for a rabbi who was also a physician, don't forget. He would have chosen his words very carefully. So why not make the king the brain of the Jewish people rather than the heart? The brain leads, but the heart serves. The brain chooses the direction and makes decisions, while the heart keeps everything, including the brain, alive and well and functioning. It's the ultimate servant-leader model in the Rambam's vision. The king is at one time the leader of all and the servant of all, a paradox of leadership that actually blends together the dual responsibilities to the people and to the ultimate ruler, the king of all kings, Melech Malchei HaMelachim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So in serving others and serving Hashem, the king as heart of the nation inspires and leads by example. In the worst of times, as we mentioned, the king does no one, anybody, any great service, thinking only about himself and leading people off the path. Yet in better times, the king sets high standards for himself and for the people, and elevates both to higher levels of fulfilling their ultimate purpose on earth. It's certainly something to think about, as we're now in the month of Elul, as the rabbis have told us in the classic metaphor. In the month of Elul, the king is in the field, on his way to the palace where he sits enthroned, but at this point, in this time, as the king is on the journey, all those who wish can approach and greet him, and the king welcomes them with a pleasant countenance. So may it be for all of us, and may we all be inscribed and sealed together for a happy and a healthy and a sweet year, a Shana Tova Umetuka. A good Shabbos.